the experience of life is to learn what are the social and the religious expectations, the religious norms of our time. And I've noticed over the last few weeks that a lot of people don't really know what we're meant to be doing in a social context now. Everything's sort of been thrown up in the air. And I've noticed it's happened in a religious context too as well. I've seen some people, they come into the church and we ask only 2 or 3 people in each pew, and then people think, oh, I still don't want to sit in the front pew. So they're hesitating to actually want to follow the new social norms or the religious norms. And we can be like that at this time where it's sort of everything we don't really know as to what we're meant to be doing. But then sometimes we can also hesitate in our relationship with God as well. And sometimes we can do that because we might lack faith at times. We might think we're not worthy to be a Christian or to be a servant of Christ. Or we can hesitate in all sorts of different ways. And I'm sure each of us in different ways have questioned our faith or hesitated in our faith. Today's gospel, Matthew, at the very end of his gospel, tells us about moments before the Ascension. And it's quite interesting what Jesus says and what Matthew tells us happens just before Jesus ascends into heaven. What we're told is that the 11 disciples, they're walking along. We know it's just outside of Jerusalem, as the first reading tells us. And Jesus is there. And they see Jesus. And some of them go to fall down to the earth. And then Matthew tells us a little phrase, a couple of words, which I think is quite significant. He says that some hesitated. They had seen Jesus. They had been with Jesus for 3 years. They knew that Jesus was crucified. They knew that Jesus was risen. Thomas had literally put his hands into the holes where the nails were. And then they see Jesus after the resurrection, moments before he ascends to heaven. Some of them fall down knowing that this is God amongst us. But even in the midst of all that, some of the disciples, some of the 11, hesitated. They weren't quite sure what to do. Should we kneel down? Or is this God? Or is this just an apparition? Is this a ghost? They had all of these questions going through their mind. And I take some solace in this because I hesitate at times as well. And I'm sure we all hesitate. We question. We sort of think, oh, is this the right thing to do? Oh, I don't really know. Oh, and you have all that going on in your mind. And you can walk into a venue now, into a supermarket or to the pub or once they open or a coffee shop. What are we meant to be doing? What are the social norms? And people start to hesitate. I've seen this at the door while I've been an attendant at the way to welcoming people. People sort of walk in and think, what am I meant to do? And they sort of hesitate. But we can do this with our faith. But the fascinating thing is, in the midst of the fact that literally moments before Jesus ascends into heaven, several of the apostles are hesitating, and Jesus still gives them a mission. He doesn't expect the fact that the apostles were going to be perfect, that they were going to be the most courageous leaders, and that they were going to go into the world immediately. Jesus knew that the apostles sort of had doubts. They were hesitating. They weren't quite sure. But in the midst of this, Jesus says to these 11, go and make disciples of all nations. Baptize them, teach them to observe all that I've asked you, and know that I will be with you always. We should take satisfaction in this as well. None of us are going to have perfect faith in this world. None of us are going to know everything about God in this world, because God is a mystery. We can learn little bits here and there. God reveals himself, but we're never going to have all the answers. But in the midst of that, God still chooses us to be his instruments of love in the world, to be his courageous witnesses. And even moments after Jesus ascends into the heavens, literally moments after Jesus has told them what they're meant to do now, they're there looking up into the sky. And they're thinking, oh, what do we do now? They start to hesitate. And then what happens? We have an angel come and says, what are you doing? Looking up at the heavens. Get on and do what you're meant to be doing. Stop hesitating and go and do the mission of God in the world. And I sometimes need that encouragement too. Maybe you used to refer to it as a kick up the backside in the right direction. Get on and do what you're meant to be doing. Stop hesitating. Go and do it. I need that encouragement. You might need that encouragement too sometimes. The apostles, they hesitated, but God still chooses them. And God chooses me, and God chooses you as well, to be the ones who go and make disciples of all the nations. That's the first thing we're called to do. Sometimes we think, oh, what do we do in the church? Oh, we baptize someone. It's actually interesting what Jesus says first. He says, go make disciples of all nations, and then baptize them. And then teach them to observe all that I have commanded you to do. Sometimes we get that order slightly skew-if. We seem to baptize people, we seem to teach them at schools, but where is going actually making disciples? All of us are called to be ones who make disciples. Disciples are the followers of Jesus. So sometimes I hesitate in trying to say, to invite someone on that journey with us. And maybe we all do as well. Let's pray today as we celebrate this great solemnity of the Ascension, that in the midst of our own hesitations, that we know that God's chosen us to be his disciples. God's chosen us to go into our world to make disciples of all the nations, of those around us, of those in our community, but those right across the entire world. And then we do what also Jesus has asked us to do. We live a sacramental life. We baptize, we live the liturgical life that we're doing right now. And then we teach others about it as well. In the midst of our hesitations, know that God's chosen us to be his disciples. God knows that we are not perfect. Let's take satisfaction in that. If you're doubting your faith today, if you're thinking, I don't really know all the answers, I think there's a problem here or a problem there, know that the disciples felt the same. They were with Jesus for 3 years. They literally ate with him. They touched him. They spoke with him. They could put their hands in the holes where the nails were, and still they were reluctant, and still they hesitated. If we hesitate, know that God still chooses us. God's still choosing us to be his disciples, to go into the whole world, to make disciples, to baptize them and to teach them, and know that Jesus will be with us until the end of the world.